Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
It's an honor to have hosted Jamie Pennebaker in his second round as being a visiting researcher at Microsoft Research. He came last year for a briefer time, and this year he's been here for a little bit longer, so he's had a little bit more time to dig in on some interesting projects along his lines of interest. Jamie is the Regents Centennial Professor of Psychology at UT Austin. I should say University of Texas at Austin, in case people don't know what UT is. Like, this is also University of Toronto people in the audience here at Microsoft Research. And he's a social psychologist. He studies how natural language reflects people's social and psychological states. He explores the links between words that we would think just fly by and we remove from our studies, function words, stop words. Their importance in language and how they can be studied to give us insights about personality, intelligence, thinking styles, social relationships, status, power, deception, and other emotion-related behaviors. He's a highly cited social scientist, and his most recent book is The Secret Life of Pronouns: What Our Words Say About Us. I have to say, since meeting Jamie, hearing his talks, and reading his work, you might notice that my email has changed a bit in terms of power relationships implied. I'm just teasing, but go with Jamie.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. By the way, there are a bunch of seats up here. So, oh yeah, I was going to do this. My first slide, oh, that's right, I'm not using any slides. What? I know, this is going to be a shock. What I wanted is to be more of a discussion and to discuss today about the nature of real-world language. It's important to appreciate that I'm coming at the nature of language from a completely different perspective than a computer scientist. And very often, if you've ever talked with a psychologist, a research psychologist, you may have had this experience that the two of you talk past each other and each of you are thinking, what in the world is this person talking about? Don't they understand anything? And let me assure you the psychologist is thinking the same thing. What I'd like to do is to give you a sense of my perspective as a social psychologist. And having spent now a lot of time with computer scientists, I have a good appreciation of your perspective. And one of the central differences in our perspectives is you have been trained to trying to think about the real world in terms of what accounts for the most variance. You're great at classifying. Machine learning is one of the most exciting tools around. However, what machine learning does is it doesn't really tell you why a person is using language or doing what they're doing. It's not a device aimed at understanding why people do what they do. I come from the perspective of trying to figure out what makes people tick, and I don't care about how much variance I'm accounting for. And in fact, the real advance, I think, is this melding of these two professions of both trying to understand what makes a person the way they are and what's driving them, but also coming at it from how can we optimize this. And I think that there should be more of an interaction between computer scientists and social psychologists because they're just a natural connection. And also, I say social psychologists because that's what I am, but there are other types of psychologists as well as cognitive psychologists and others. So a little bit of background. A social psychologist is somebody who studies interactions, group behaviors, and other things like that. When I began my career, I was interested in mind-body issues. Why do people get sick when they do? How do they perceive their bodies and so forth? And I had done a number of studies on this, and I was putting together a book, and it occurred to me, you know, I ought to just give people a general questionnaire to find out who reports physical symptoms. And this was a really different type of project for me, and I got together 3 students of mine, and I said, I want us to come up with a questionnaire, and you can ask people, the idea is, ask people whatever you want. What do you think would be interesting to know about people? So we started generating questions. We asked questions about what they ate, what their relationships with other people, how they got along with their parents. And one of the students in my group said, ooh, how about this? Did you ever have a traumatic sexual experience prior to the age of 17? And I thought, sure, that sounds good. So we stuck that on. And then we passed this out to about 800 students, and we found that about 15% reported having had a traumatic sexual experience prior to the age of 17. Now, here's what was interesting. This was a 12-page questionnaire. This was back when you actually handed out pieces of paper. And that one question was related to every health problem we had on the questionnaire. And about this time, I was contacted by a magazine that was very popular at the time, Psychology Today, and they were doing a study, an article on physical symptoms, and they called me because that's what I was doing research on. And they were going to do a survey in the magazine that people would mail back. So you can see this is in the old days. This was not a random sample, but they got 24,000 people responding to this questionnaire. And one of the questions I had on the question, and that one was the sexual trauma question. That we found 22% of women, 11% of men reporting having had a traumatic sexual experience prior to the age of 17. And those who endorsed it were 2 to 3 times more likely to have been hospitalized for any cause the previous year. They're more likely to have been diagnosed with high blood pressure, cancer, colds, flus, everything that we asked. And I started to become fascinated by this. Why is it that people who report this question have so many health problems? So we started doing more surveys, and what we found was it wasn't a sexual trauma per se. It was having any kind of major upheaval in your life that you kept secret. That was one thing about a traumatic sexual experience. Unlike most other traumas, almost everybody who had had one kept it secret. And this started to make me wonder, does holding a secret, a major secret, is that possible that is kind of the toxic agent? In fact, we did some surveys finding that if you found 2 people, one who had the same kind of trauma, who both said it was equally traumatic, and one they had confided in others and the others hadn't, the person who had not confided it was far more likely to get sick. And then this led me to the next part of my career, where we had people come in the lab and had them divulge secrets. We had them write about emotional upheavals. And so we would do these studies. We'd bring people in. They'd be randomly assigned to write about one of 2 conditions. In one condition, we asked them to write about the most traumatic, upsetting experience of their lives, and the other half were asked to write about superficial topics. And we had them write for 4 days, 15 minutes each. And it was a powerful experiment. These students wrote about horrific stories. And what we discovered was those people who were asked to write about traumatic experiences in the months afterwards went to the Student Health Center at about half the rate as people in our control conditions. And this study, that first study, was published in the mid-'80s, and then we started to do some other studies, and then other labs started to do other studies, and by now there's probably between 300 and 400 studies that have been published using this method. It's called the expressive writing method. And it's been shown to be linked to improvements in physical health, mental health. People do better in college afterwards. They do. It's shown to have a profound effect on people's emotional state, their relationships with others, and so forth. But the question that started to bug me in the early 90s was, why does writing make such a difference? And there had been a number of studies trying to test various models, and they all kind of came out. And one thing that occurred to me, wouldn't it be interesting just to go in and to analyze what they had actually written? Can you tell who's going to benefit from writing by just looking at the way they put their story together? Now, at the time, the first thing I did was to rely on judges. Nowadays, I would have used some kind of crowdsourcing, but this crowdsourcing was basically some graduate students in clinical psychology, a few clinicians. We had them read these stories, and in some of our projects, we would get the people whose health improved. We call that group X, and we have another group of people who wrote and whose health did not improve. We call that group Y. And then I'd say, give them a group of essays from group X and group Y and ask, what's the difference? Well, the thing about this is if you ask people to read traumatic stories, what it does is it depresses them. And so here we discovered a technique that, first of all, was not very reliable. That is, judges didn't agree very well. It took forever. It was expensive, and it depressed the people who were doing it. This is not an efficient way to build a career. So it occurred to me, I had taken Fortran in college. I've always been interested in at least low-level programming. And it occurred to me, maybe we just need a computer program that could analyze language. And initially I started calling friends around the country, asking them who has a program like this, because it seems obvious that there should be such a program, and I couldn't find anybody. So working with one of my graduate students who actually had been a computer science major as an undergraduate, we built a program called LIWC, L-I-W-C, Linguistic Inquiry and Wordcount, a remarkably stupid program. By your standards, I hope you are horrified how simple this program was. The idea was, I wanted to come up with a method by which to go into any given text and calculate the percentage of words that were positive emotion words, negative emotion words, anger words, sadness words, etc. But also cognitive words, words that told us that people were thinking in certain kinds of ways. And also words that would get at specific topics. And there were certain theories that were hot at the time, and I wanted to be sure to capture those. And then we would get groups of judges to generate words. We get words from thesauruses and elsewhere, and we would come up with lists of words, and each word was judged by multiple people. So it was a human-based system. What we discovered, and as long as we were doing this, we also threw in other words, including various common things like pronouns, prepositions, articles, and so forth. And what we discovered early on was there were certain classes of words that seemed to predict health improvement. One was, we found that, for example, use of positive emotion words. The more positive emotion words a person used in their writing, the more their health improved. So if they'd had a traumatic experience and they could still use words like joy, love, happiness, they were much better off than if they didn't. And ironically, even if they said, I'm not happy, this experience gives me no joy, saying you're not happy is a predictor of getting better as opposed to saying sad. In other words, if a person's not happy, they're still thinking along this dimension of happiness. And negations, by the way, are very interesting, but we're not going to get into that today. Life's too short. But another dimension that we found on that first run was that cognitive words. And cognitive words included words like because, cause, effect, causal words, and insight words, understand, realize, know, and etc. That people who increased in their use of these cognitive words over time benefited, whereas people who did not increase over time did not. And the effect sizes for the cognitive words was much, much bigger than the emotion words. And using some other analyses a little bit later, this is when I briefly got into the LSA, the Latent Semantic Analysis world. What we also discovered was that that certain classes of pronouns predicted improvement. And basically, what we found was that people who flipped back and forth between using first-person singular pronouns, I, me, and my, and other pronouns like he, she, they, you, even we, and going back and forth between those in no particular order was associated with improved health, whereas people who wrote using pronouns in the same way across those 4 days did not improve. And the effect sizes were quite big, and these were averaging across multiple studies.
Do you have a sense of why?
I'm going to tell you. The reason is, great question. How about this? What we think it was changing in perspective. It's a marker of perspective switch. And it's very similar to what a therapist would do. A therapist would do this. If I went into a therapist and I said, I'm having problems with my relationship with my wife, she does this, she does this, she does this, she does that, a therapist would say, stop. How about you? How do you feel? And if I went in, I said, I'm having trouble with my wife, and I feel this, I feel that, I feel this, the therapist would say, stop. Tell me about your wife. What's your wife's perspective? And what this is doing is that people who naturally can do this are the people who seem to benefit more quickly. Now, about this time, I was also, it was a very interesting time because the mid-90s were a time, mid to late 90s were a time where the internet came of age. All of a sudden, I had access to data that I've never had before in digital form, and I'd start downloading. Every night I'd come home and I'd just download data. And one of my favorite places was AOL. Again, for some of you, this has meaning. For some of you, this sounds, wow, that sounds like history. I read about that somewhere. But there were these AOL chat groups that were fabulous. In any case, I'd sit and I'd analyze the data using my computer program, and I became interested in sex differences. And because we all have an intuitive sense of how men and women talk. And what I would download this and I'd analyze it, and it came out backwards from everything I thought. And I did what all good scientists do. I ignored it because it can't be true. It was a fluke. And then, a few weeks later, I'd do another download. I'd analyze it. Came out backwards. Flukes. These things happen. And I did this several times before I started to think, maybe I should just line up all of my studies and see how men and women are behaving. And what I discovered were some really striking differences. Now, before I tell you those differences, another side issue. I was on my way to give a talk somewhere, and I had just bought a book by George Miller called The Science of Words. Science of Words was interesting because he made a distinction in it that I'd never heard of. By the way, I have no linguistics training. I don't understand linguistics. And I tried. By God, I did try. But it just was not a field that I could ever wrap my head around. But Miller was interesting because he started to break words down in ways that made sense. And one was this profound difference between what he called content words and function words. Content words are essentially nouns, regular verbs, and adjectives and most adverbs. These are content. When you're having a substantive conversation with somebody, these are the words that your brain is processing. The average person in this room has a vocabulary of between 50 and 100,000 words, of which 50 and 100,000 words, all of which are content words, except for a small group of other words called function words. And function words are pronouns, I, me, you, he, she, it, prepositions, 2 of 4, articles, a, and, and, the, conjunctions, and, or, but, negations, no, not, never, and selected adverbs that don't have any direct reference, like so, very, really, words such as that. Now, what's interesting about all of these is that these function words, there's only 500 in English. And no matter what other languages you speak, you have function words as well, and they account for a very small part of vocabulary. And what's interesting is, even though there's very few of these function words, they account for over half of the words that we use. What I've said so far, 55% of the words I've said so far, I've been counting, have been function words. Now, in the next few minutes, you're going to start listening to what I'm saying. You're going to start paying attention to the function words, and you're going to give up really quickly because your brain can't process them. They come in, first of all, in terms of speed, they come in at priming speed. And secondly, if you start paying attention to these function words, you can't hear what I'm saying. And this is what's so interesting. These words are there for everybody. Why are they there? Well, they're shortcuts. And they're also words that shape what I'm saying in some very interesting ways that I'll tell you in just a second. And the other issue is function words and content words are processed in the brain very differently. So, for example, there are 2 areas that we've long known to be related to language, and they're particularly interesting in looking at brain damage. The two areas are, for almost everybody in this room, are on the left side of your brain, even if you're left-handed. And the one that's about right here in the temporal lobe is called Wernicke's area, and the one that's right up here is in the frontal lobe and is called Broca's area. If there's damage to the frontal lobe and Broca's area is damaged, the way the person speaks is really slow and hesitating. So if I asked a person with Broca's damage to describe this up here, the person might say, podium wire, computer screen, and it would be a pretty boring conversation. And also with a great deal of hesitancy, and the person also would be clearly lacking in social skills, which is interesting in terms because the frontal lobe is associated with frontals.
Do you know if the order in which objects are named with someone with damage to Broca's area is in an order that would reflect some sort of correct syntactic construction, such as animate things being named
That's
first?
a great question. I don't know. I have no idea. Wow, excellent question. Damage to Wernicke's area is interesting because historically it's generally described as a word salad. But if you listen to the salad, here's what it would be. So if I asked a person with the Wernicke's damage to describe this, they'd say, much like this, oh yeah, sure. This is right here, and next to that is this, and you can see that, and right here is this. All of the words are function words. Now, what's interesting, function words are social. They require social skills to use. So, for example, let's say there's a piece of paper in the room, and I come, and I'm the first one in the room. I pick up the piece of paper, and it says, I'm not here. I'll be right back. Does that note make sense? Well, yeah, kind of. But on another level, it makes absolutely no sense because it's on the floor. It might have just blown in from somewhere else. And it doesn't make sense because who's I? Will implies future tense. When was it written? Be back. Back, does this mean back here? Or where was the note actually from? In other words, these words are words that only have meaning between the speaker and listener at one particular point in time in a particular location. And even if we found the author of that note a year from now, and we gave the note to the author and asked, what did this mean? The author might say, I have no idea. Now here's what's interesting. As you start looking at these function words, they start to tell us who people are. And it was interesting, it was only these function words that we were finding differences between males and females. Males and females generally, when downloading things, were by and large talking about similar topics, not completely, but similar. But their use of these function words are profoundly different. So for example, I'm not even going to ask you this because it'll just embarrass you. And if it makes you feel any better, I've embarrassed people at Stanford, at Harvard, at Cambridge, at junior colleges, at the people who've been best have been people in old age homes, which is actually, I find, both interesting and a little disturbing. Although it's good for me. But the point is, okay, so here would be the test I would give you. Who uses the word I more, men or women? Well, the answer is women, overwhelmingly, across almost all contexts. Who uses we words more, men or women? Of course, you all know it's women, but of course it's not, because I wouldn't be asking it. There's no difference. Articles, a, an, and the. You would guess women, but you have no idea. In fact, it's men, overwhelmingly. Who uses emotion words more? You would probably say women. You'd be wrong. There's no difference. Cognitive words like because, cause, effect, words such as that. You would think men. Again, you'd be wrong. It's women. And who uses social words more? He, she, they, we, etc. You would guess women, and thank God you got one right. And the mistakes you would make are exactly the ones I made when I started as well. And then starting to go in and analyze this more, it's important to know that function words tell us where people are paying attention. So pronouns tell us where people are paying attention. Now, most people would think that the reason people think men use words more is because they think, well, men are self-centered, they're arrogant, etc. Well, they might be self-centered and arrogant, but that doesn't mean that's where they're paying attention. I means you're looking inward. You're looking, it's a self-focus, and women are more self-focused than men. And as we've done studies, and others have now as well, anything that causes you to pay attention to self, to your body, boosts the rate of your using the word I. So for example, people who are physically sick use I much more than people who are not physically sick. People who are depressed use I words more than people who are not depressed. We words are interesting. There's no difference there because there are two types of we words. One we word type is you and me together, holding hands, it's beautiful. And women actually do use that kind of we more. But the other kind of we is the we, which means it's the kind of we I use with my graduate students. Well, guys, we need to analyze this data differently. And that does not mean we're going to hold hands analyzing the data together. It's essentially a shortcut for you. And males use that kind of we much more. And if you cannot determine who the referent is, it's probably a male. It's also interestingly that when you can't figure out who the referent is in we, the person's being deceptive. And what you can do is actually look at politicians. Politicians use we all the time. And the more the politician uses we, the more you should be nervous. And let's see. Oh, cognitive words are always fun. Cognitive words are interesting. Well, let's do cognitive and articles. Males use articles at much higher rates, A, N, and the. And the reason is you only use articles in front of, or almost always, in terms of concrete objects or things. So if you are talking about carburetors or a certain computer chip, you are going to use lots of articles. However, if you are talking about more social things, you don't use articles. And in fact, that's the big difference. Males generally talk more about objects and things, and women tend to talk more about people. That's why females tend to use social words more. And what's interesting is that when you're talking about people, people are far more complex than objects and things. We like to think rocket science is the most complex thing. That's ridiculous. Human beings are far more complex than a rocket. You can get the best scientists in the world and predict how this group of 10 randomly selected people are going to behave in the next room over the next 3 weeks. You can't do it. Whereas you can do that with really good scientists predicting a rocket. The point is that when males or when people are talking about relationships, they have to use much more cognitive words. Why is it that Joe is interested in Sally when everybody knows that she's the terrible person for him, and you're starting to use believe, think, understand, cause, and effect, whereas when you're talking about carburetor broken. Sand. Yeah. So the point is that men and women are using language different. Now, I want to make it clear, I don't really care about differences between men and women. I'm using this more as an example of how we can start to think about these words as reflecting thinking. Now, my real interest over the last several years has been to look at the nature of language, and especially function words, across 3 domains. The first is essentially personality dimensions. The second is kind of situational dimensions. And the last are looking at it in terms of social processes. And I'll talk about each of these briefly. The first is trying to understand the differences or how we can get a sense of people's personalities by the way they use words. And we started this, actually, it wasn't a personality project, but it was actually the first study that I did that was trying to get a sense at who people are. And this was looking at who commits suicide. And we were looking at poets. Poets commit suicide at incredibly high rates. It's probably the most dangerous profession on earth if you're a published poet. So what we did was we got a small group of poets who committed suicide and a control group of poets that we matched in terms of when they were born, age, sex, education, and so forth. The study was only about 16 people, as I recall. So 8 in each condition. And we analyzed their poetry. And I was honestly, because this was before I had really gotten into any of this research, I was thinking, well, this will be easy because the people who are going to commit suicide are going to talk a lot about death, they're going to be more depressed, and so forth. The only difference we found was the use of the word I, that suicidal poets use the word I at much higher rates than non-suicidal poets. They didn't differ in terms of negative emotion words, they didn't differ in terms of death-related words either. So it was quite interesting that this one feature, the use of I, was so different. And it's important to appreciate I words are a fairly high base rate word. In natural conversation and probably even in poetry, I is the most common word used by people, which is probably around 4% of all the words we use. I then got involved working with some clinicians, and we did a series of studies looking at people who were clinically depressed, who previously been depressed, and people who were not depressed, looking at how they wrote essays on coming to college. And again, the people who were depressed used I words the most, people who were not depressed used I words the least, and people who had been depressed but were not now were somewhere in between. We've also looked at this as I've been called several times to do an analysis of a person in terms of did they really commit suicide. And the most interesting case was the analysis of an Australian explorer, Henry Hellyer, who died mysteriously in the 1840s. And the big question was, did he commit suicide or was he murdered? And a lot of his writings were available. And what was interesting was by looking at his writings, what we found was in the years and months as he got closer to death, his use of I spiked just prior to his death, which suggests very strongly that it would probably be suicide. Now, we've also looked at this in terms of other individual differences. Let's see, what are some others? One thing that we've been doing a lot of work on recently is thinking style. Can you get a sense of how people think? Recently we did this project where we analyzed the admissions essays for people who have been accepted to the University of Texas. This was 25,000 students. Each person had to write 2 essays. And what we did was to go through and these were people a few years back so we could track their grade point average over 4 years. And what we did is we went through and we looked at these 8 dimensions of function words. And what we were able to do is to come up with the psychometrics of function words are gorgeous. So I spent a lot of time in the world of psychometrics, and articles and prepositions are positively correlated with each other. I'm sorry?
What are psychometrics?
Psychometrics means when you're coming up with a scale, you want to find out, is this scale internally consistent? In other words, does each part of the scale measure the construct that you're trying to get at? So an SAT test, for example, you would hope that all 40 questions, let's say we're looking at the math part, all 40 questions are at least somewhat related to the other questions, and that each question is related to the sum of all the other questions, because you're trying to get at this coherent construct of intelligence. And the same thing is true for personality and so forth. So what we find is that articles and prepositions are both positively correlated with each other. They go in the same direction. The more you use articles, the more you use prepositions. These other 6 dimensions that we're focusing on, personal pronouns, impersonal pronouns, adverbs, auxiliary verbs, etc., those are all internally correlated with each other as well, and those 6 are negatively correlated with articles and prepositions, meaning we could turn these up, we can reverse score all of these, and all of them are correlated with each other. They're all getting at the same general concept of what I would call the thinking style. And we're calling this thinking style a categorical dynamic index. And this categorical dynamic index means the higher you score on it, that is, the more you use articles and prepositions, the less you use these other things, the more you are categorizing the world, the more you are looking at the world in a logical, formal, hierarchical way. At the other end, people who are using lots of pronouns, auxiliary verbs, conjunctions, and so forth, these people are looking at the world in much more of a narrative way. They're telling stories. And it's really quite interesting. So you can go in and pull out the top scorers, and you read these essays. And the essays are not very, frankly, very interesting. I want to come to the, there are 3 reasons I want to attend the University of Texas. The first is their computer science department is very, holds great promise in my interest, blah, blah, blah. And then you pull out the bottom ones of this dimension, and it'll say, the reason I've been interested in computer science was because when I was 5 years old, my family moved from Oklahoma to Tennessee, and on the way this happened. In other words, they're telling a story, and you're thinking, wow, what a great story. And then you look and see how these people do in college. And the correlation between this CDI score and 4-year GPA is about a 0.2 correlation. And a 0.2 correlation predicting 4 years later is really pretty remarkable. So the higher, the more formal, the more you're using these categorical words, the better you do in college. Telling stories, you're screwed. And this is true, by the way, if you're in fine arts, if you're in physics, if you're in, it makes no difference what field you are. The higher you are in categorical thinking, the better you do. And one reason is all the tests, whether you're in fine arts, English, in any area of science, whatever, they're asking you to analyze, to think logically. They're not asking you, for this test, could you tell me a story about protons? So so this is what American and probably world education is to think in logical, formal ways. Now, what's interesting is CDI is also highly stable. In other words, it's almost a personality dimension. And recently we've been using this as a marker of using it for author identification. And with one of my graduate students, we've just published an article on the discovery of or it's been discovered a long time, but it deals with a book play thought to have been by Shakespeare. Scholars have been arguing about this particular play for the last 300 years. So Shakespeare died in the early 1600s. 100 years later, a guy by the name of John Thibault in London claimed he had discovered 3 manuscripts written by Shakespeare, and that he now had put them together and come up with and had a new play that was called Double Falsehood. And in fact, the story matched one that they knew existed, that had been presented in the early 1600s. And so ever since the early 1700s, scholars have been fighting whether or not this was a real play by Shakespeare or not. So we simply went in and analyzed all of Shakespeare's work, all of Thibault's work, and there's Theobald, and then there's another guy, John Fletcher, who had actually co-written a couple of plays by Shakespeare. And using CDI, and also we use both machine learning and some other methods, actually use multiple methods, and all of them showed this play really does have the fingerprint of Shakespeare. And there's a little bit of fingerprint of John Fletcher in the last 2 acts, which actually is very similar to 2 of the other plays that we know that Fletcher and Shakespeare collaborated on. But the point is even using this kind of metric, this categorical thinking metric, is interesting because it's telling us differences between people. Now, personality is one issue. It's also interesting to look at how people's language changes as a function of big, events in their lives. Can we tell what's going on in your life by the way you're using language? And in fact, we can get a sense. We know, for example, the older you get, there's certain changes in the way you use words. So, for example, as you get older, and again, this goes opposite of what I think most people here would have predicted. Certainly it's different from what I've predicted. The older you get, the more people use positive emotion words and the less they use negative emotion words. The older you get, the more you use future tense and the less you use past tense. Yes?
So is it the fact that those people survive, or?
That's a good question. Is it just the survival? I think not. You know, our samples are sufficiently large and diverse. And I can tell you why the answer is no, because we also analyzed text from authors, including Shakespeare, who wrote over a large part of their lives, and they showed the same pattern. So as they got older, they used more positive emotion words, fewer negative emotion words, fewer I words, more we words, more cognitively complex words as you get older, which kind of makes sense. When you're young, you know, you're in your teens, your 20s, your emotional life is going up and down like crazy. As you get older, it goes like this. Hey, but it's all great. Kids are gone. Yeah, this is life's simple.
Do you see people getting stuck in this and not moving in that direction?
Of course, I'm sure there. The nature of our statistics, we don't look at that, but of course there are. So there, all of this. Please understand, I'm speaking in generalization. So in everything I've told you, most of the people the majority of people are probably going in the way that I'm telling you, but there's always some that are not. And maybe the ones who aren't changing, they're going to die soon. I don't know. We've also been interested in looking at specific events. So, for example, we looked at 9/11. We had about 1,000 bloggers who were heavy users of livejournal.com, and we had these people to be in our study. They had to post on average at least every other day. And what we were able to track was what happened to this sample on 9/11. And many of the things you would expect. So immediately afterwards, there's a drop in positive emotion words and an increase in negative emotion words. But what's interesting is how long do emotions last? And what we found was once 9/11 hit, by the way, we had data for 4 months, 2 months before 9/11, 2 months afterwards. So we have a really stable baseline. What happened is immediately after 9/11, you get a big increase in negative emotions, and it takes about 11 days before they get back to baseline. Positive emotion words were very different. Positive emotion words, there's a big drop, and it comes up very quickly, and by day 4, they're at baseline, and day 5, they're above baseline, and they stay above baseline for the next 2 months. An interesting irony, 9/11, and I think this is true for many major events, is associated with long-term positive emotions. And why would that be? Because it brings the culture together. It's a social phenomenon. So one thing we looked at was the use of the word we. What you find at 9/11 is there's a huge drop in I. And remember, I told you I was associated with depression. People are not depressed. There's a difference between depression and being sad. There was a drop in I and a huge increase in we. And this increase in we, it went up, and then within a couple of weeks it came back down, but it didn't come down to baseline, and in fact over the next 2 months it remained above baseline. So upheavals are interesting because they do foster social interactions with others. We've also been interested in how you can use language to track threat. So for example, we've been interested in can you predict if a leader is going to go to war? And there have been lots of leaders that have attacked others. And one of the interesting ones was George Bush and going to war with Iraq. And what we did was to analyze all his press conferences, just his language in press conferences. And Bush, unlike presidents before and after him, spoke to the press a huge amount, which from a data perspective is fabulous. Mm-hmm. And what you find with him was his use of I words were pretty constant up until August of 2002. And all of a sudden, his use of I words dropped from about 4% to 2%. Now that's, by the way, that's a huge, huge drop. And it stayed at that level until after we went to war about 8 months later in, I guess it was February or March of 2003, and then it gradually came back. Now, I became curious. So, by the way, I didn't tell you about deception. When people lie, they tend to stop using I. They start distancing themselves. And by the way, we went and looked at other leaders who have threatened and gone to war, and we found this same general pattern. There's a drop in I. And I think part of it is that if a leader is thinking seriously of attacking, they're holding their cards. They don't want to convey what they're doing. Now, we've done the same thing in looking at the tweets of the Boston bomber, the one who has just been convicted. And what we found with him was he was using Twitter. He used Twitter at a very good rate. And his rates of using I was about, I think it was around 7 or 8%. And in October, about mid-October, his use of I words in all his tweets dropped to a very low level, and it stayed that way all the way till the actual bombing. And I would submit that that is probably when he made a decision to join his brother in the bombing. The point is that it's interesting to start using these kinds of signals to get a sense of people's psychological state. Let me make another kind of side note here. In the computer science world, there is a huge interest in sentiment analysis. And sentiment analysis is generally thought of as emotions. The idea that you can tell a person or a group's emotional state by looking at the use of emotion words. This makes sense on one level, in that it seems like that which is just common sense. But it doesn't make sense from a psychologist's perspective, because language did not evolve to express emotions through words, because emotions are expressed often through actions, tone of voice, and so forth. That emotions are also expressed through these function words. So, for example, if I'm angry at you, I may not say the word angry at all, and I can read your email and I can tell you're pissed, even though you don't say the word angry. It's leaking out through these other dimensions. And in fact, we do a pretty good job at identifying emotional state. In fact, we do just about as well, and sometimes better, predicting an emotional state by looking at function words as opposed to just emotion words. So the two types of information are really important. So sentiment analysis really is more than just, or should be a lot more than just emotion words. Yeah.
Curious, so you mentioned that when people are lying, they start to use I a lot less. But you also mentioned way back in the beginning that this keeping a traumatic experience secret was a marked indicator of sort of like future health bad outcomes, and that people who use I more often tend to have those bad outcomes.
Well, we're juggling different issues here. When a person is actively holding back something, holding a big secret and not telling another person, they will use I less. In other words, they are, and this is what's so intriguing, is there's a lot of work on the links between self-deception and other deception. And one model right now is that they're really kind of the same things. So if I've had a major upheaval and I don't want you to know about it, our interactions are going to get stilted, because I'm not going to say much about me. I'm also going to be thinking about that event quite a bit, and I'm not going to be paying much attention to you. And so, and this fits in with, there's now been dozens of studies looking at the nature of deception in language. And across multiple studies, the general pattern, and I should tell you there's some interesting weirdness about deception because there's so many different types of deception. So deception, writing a Yelp review, is different from deception in terms of interpersonal, me lying to you or vice versa. In the more personal, me lying to you, and also the criminal investigation world, deception's markers are low use of I. Another one is lack of complexity in language. One of the dimensions of complexity are what we call exclusive words, words like except, without, but. And it turns out that when you're lying, it's almost impossible to use those words because these exclusive words are making a distinction between what is in a category and what's not in the category. This is in it, but not that. And if I ask you, what were you doing last Saturday night, and you did something that was illegal, and I'm the policeman asking you, you're going to say, oh, well, I did this and I did that, and then my friend, he did this, and then we went here and we did that. If I'm telling the truth, I'll say, well, I went to the store, I was going to get this, but then I realized I forgot this, but then I did this, but then I didn't do that. In other words, I'm saying what I did do and didn't do. And if you're lying, it just becomes way too complex to say what you didn't do because you didn't do any of it. Yeah. So, exactly. So, now this brings us to this last issue about, these are some of the situational factors. One of the issues that's also interesting is looking at social factors. For example, can we look at social relationships through the nature of language and function words? And one of the things I've been intrigued with is the nature of status. Who's got higher versus lower status? And one thing that we've discovered is the relative use of I is a really powerful marker. In any interaction, the person who's the higher status uses the word I less, the opposite of what you think. And the person who is lower status uses the word I more. And we first did this project with emails, and then we did it with experiments where we would manipulate status, and other ones where we just have people come and talk. And then we analyzed letters that we had access to in terms of people in the military, high versus low rank and so forth. And you can take this to the bank. And I was looking at our very first project with email, and I was thinking, well, that's interesting. I bet it's not true for me, though, because I love everybody. You know, everybody's equal. And so I looked at my data, and it was just like everybody else's. And what happened is an undergraduate would write me, "Dear Dr. Pennebaker, I am so-and-so, and I was wondering if I could meet you because I'd like to talk about so-and-so." And then I write back, "Dear student, thank you so much for your email. How about next Tuesday? That seems like that would work." And then I look at my email to the dean. "Dear Dean, I'm Jamie Pennebaker, and I want to know if I can do this and I can do that." And then the dean writes back, "Dear Jamie, thank you so much for your email." Da, da, da. Now, what's interesting about this is nobody is putting anybody down. This is not some kind of nasty stuff. This is the language of power and status in our culture. Now, here's an interesting issue. I've talked about this finding to groups everywhere. And Americans often come up to me afterward and say, "Wow, I didn't realize I was using language this way. I'm going to stop using I in my emails." And I always think, wow, that's kind of interesting. And then I spoke to a group, and there was a guy who was from China, and he came up and he said, "Wow, that was a great talk. I now realize I need to start using I words more in my emails." And I was thinking, this guy gets it. Because if I'm the high status person and somebody else is a low status person, and they send me an email and they are trying to, say, I've got a lot of power, that kind of puts me off. If they come to me and they basically are being more genuine, that works, because that's what a natural interaction is. So it's very interesting how we as a culture interpret these findings. You wouldn't believe how many emails I get where people will not use I once. And then I'll have a PS at the bottom. "It took me 30 minutes to write this email because I wanted to not use I." Also, by the way, if you feel self-conscious talking to me, forget it. I can't hear it. Send it to me, but send me what you want to say by text, and then I'll put it in my computer program. But I can't hear it. Yeah.
Is there a difference between spoken communication and written
It's
communication?
very similar. There are, of course, some differences, but in terms of the general patterns, everything holds up pretty much the same.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you mentioned a bit about culture. I'm wondering what are the variations?
Okay.
It's not only the interpretation.
So we've done cultural studies, and we're finding the same general patterns in terms of status, depression, kind of the major things we've looked at, sex differences. They hold up in every culture we've looked at so far. And we've looked at it in a lot of different ways. So our computer program, Luke, we've got it in about 15 different languages. And the languages that are most disparate from English that we've looked at have been Chinese, Hungarian, which is disparate from every damn language there is. We've done all the European languages, Russian, but the patterns hold up remarkably similarly.
I expect at least few takeaways to be different. Some languages don't have that many articles.
That's right. However,
less seamless.
That's right. However, so several languages don't have articles, but every language can distinguish between the cup from a cup, but different languages bounce around that. So in Chinese, if you say cup, it means a cup. So you don't need a, but if you mean that cup, there's some word for that or this particular cup. So they all exist. But it's true, every culture has some interesting subtle differences in function words that I think says a lot about the culture itself. Let me go through two more things really quickly. I've gone on already much more longer than I usually do. In terms of these social dynamics, a second issue beyond status is trying to get a sense of, can you get a sense of how two people are connecting with one another? This is a Cortana kind of issue as well. The question is how do you know if two people are clicking, they're connecting? Well, one thing we've come up with is a metric that we call language style matching, or LSM. And we essentially calculate a score in terms of how similar the two people are using pronouns, prepositions, articles, conjunctions, and so forth. And you come up with a very simple metric. And what you find is the more the two are matching, the more they're on the same page. So for example, we did an analysis of speed dating. And speed dating is glorious from a researcher's perspective, where we've analyzed the language of the two people. And what we find is that we can predict who will go out on a subsequent date at rates higher than the people themselves. And you're thinking, well, that's not possible. Well, it is possible because there's a lot of people who one person says, yeah, this would be great. And the other person saying, are you kidding? They would have low style matching. It's only when the two people both are on the same page. We've also looked at a separate study with 86 dating couples among college freshmen. Freshman dating couples are great to study because they're really unstable. And basically you need variance. And we gave these, and to be in our study, they had to do instant messaging, to IM quite a bit. And they had to agree to give us 10 days or 9 days of their IMs. And what we found was the greater their style matching, the more likely they were to be together 3 months later. In fact, those who were above the mean, above the average, 80% were still dating 3 months later. Those that were below the mean, only 50% were still dating. Now, so that's the style matching work. We've also been using this in terms of small groups. So I teach a giant introductory online course of about around 1,500 students. And we break the students every day into small groups, or every other day. And every time they're in a different group. And one thing that we can do is we can assess the degree to which we can do language style matching across them and find out the degree to which they're on the same page. And what we're trying to now figure out is, can we manipulate the group? Because we're monitoring the group constantly, and we can now give the group feedback in terms of, are you all on the same page? You're not paying attention to one another, and other ways of manipulating this.
When it comes to the groups that work working well together, or a couple that might stay together, what can you say about not just the matching, but the nature of the staff?
Well, that's our problem. Our groups are not, we don't allow them to stay together. So each time is very different.
How about the couple? In other words, like
Oh.
I words, function words, it's not just in style matching, it's like imagine tons
What
of
we're-
eyes on both sides,
What-
tons of no eyes on both sides.
Well,
So
what's interesting with the couples, it doesn't really matter. So if the two couples aren't, if both of them are not using I words, that's fine. You know, they're both probably geeks talking about this program that they're working on. But that's beautiful. And then there are other people who are, you know, one who's really self-obsessed and the other one's self-obsessed. That's beautiful.
But no signal yet. No, but you haven't said the signal about the nature of it.
No,
Okay.
no. And by the way, these are kind of first analyses.
Yeah.
So that's that group data. There was one other issue. If I had an overhead, I wouldn't have to. Oh yeah. And this is starting to look at communities, and so looking at, say, blogging communities. What can we learn about people in terms of their social dynamics there? And this actually gets at this a little bit. One of my former students, Cindy Chung, did this dissertation that was just lovely. What she did was to look at diet.com. She was interested in diet blogs. And one thing that's cool about diet.com is people post their weights whenever they post. And so what she can do is track them over time to see who loses weight. And she's interested in, can you tell the language of weight losers versus those who don't lose weight? And in terms of the actual language, the more personal their writing is, the more likely they are to lose weight. But there was one thing that predicted weight loss far better than anything, and that was the comments. Now, I would have predicted, most of my colleagues in social psychology would have predicted, that the more comments you receive, the more likely you are to lose weight. Turns out it has virtually no effect. Instead, it's the more comments you make on other people's blogs, the more you lose weight. It's kind of the difference between giving and receiving. That giving aid and support seems to be much healthier than just receiving it. And there are all sorts of interesting theories that might explain this, and one of them is it suggests a greater commitment to the community, a greater perhaps commitment to weight loss as well. Now, what I've done is given you a huge bunch of results in a very, very short time. And the time that I've spent here at MSR has been honestly fabulous, because I've spoken with a number of you, and it's the kind of work that's being done here is breathtaking. And from a social psychologist's perspective, I think you can start to see why I'm so excited talking with people, because you guys are, first of all, have access to data that is unbelievable. And the questions you're addressing are fascinating, and many, perhaps most, are at their very core deeply social psychological questions. And this is why I think there's just a natural affinity between our fields. And I would urge you to go outside the computer science community. God knows I love the computer science community, but also go out and have lunch with a social psychologist. So I'm going to stop here and open it up to questions. So I guess I can hit. Yeah.
With the freshman dating study, I was reminded actually of an experience I just had this morning with a woman I ran into who said she should ping my wife. And she doesn't have a computer science background, and I'm sure she picked up ping from her husband, who is a computer scientist, and this is CS terminology.
Right.
With those freshmen, did you have any way to factor out the fact that some of them may have spent enough time together that they were starting to talk like each other?
Funny you should ask. One of the things I'm interested in, this is what I call my linguistic drone project, which is, that's right, you all have drones, so that we can work together. Can you identify a person by the way they use function words in terms of who they are hanging around with and where they are in the country? So what we were able to do with this project, because most of these people went to high schools in the state of Texas. And so what we were able to do is I picked 8 high schools that were fairly similar in terms of social class and analyzed any given group and to see if how well I could pick a particular person or group of people here and would they be classified correctly. And I did better than chance, not great, but which tells me that the people within a high school are probably being taught in similar ways, and they probably talk together and adopt a similar kind of language. The signal's not very strong, but there's something there. Yeah.
A lot of the trends you're talking about, say in function word uses, are very subtle and very surprising to us. Do you have any sense of whether writers, particularly fiction writers, who are good at creating a voice that isn't their own, are they doing that mostly through content words, or they just have an intuitive understanding and way to leverage this that is beyond what us regular folks can do?
Well, it's funny because I gave a talk at the University of Toronto, and somebody asked that same question, and I remember answering, because my wife's an author, I basically said, oh, well, writers clearly can get into the heads. And then that night I went back, and on my computer I actually had some data. And turns out I was wrong. Most writers are really good at conveying characters through content, but they're not as good through function words. And we've done analyses. There's some authors who are actually very good at conveying the tone of the opposite sex. But in general, most writers make their opposite sex characters speak like their own gender. Also, we've done some interesting work on TED Talks that have been translated, and we find that the language of the TED Talk reflects the translator more than it does the actual speaker. Yeah. Yes?
So a lot of people clearly kind of pick up on the power of changing language. Like if I use I less, will I convey more status? And that kind of makes sense from a social standpoint where my language is communicating something to you. Does it work on an internal part? I less depressed? Or?
Yeah. No, we've done several studies on this because it's a really important question. Does language drive a psychological state? We've done these studies, and it's pretty easy to change people's language, by the way. So we will have questionnaires, and we'll have open-ended questions saying, tell us about your first year in college. Here's what some other people say. And all the examples are we. Or in the other condition, all in I. And then they write, what do you think? And people will write the way the other people do. It has no effect on anything psychological that we've measured. So if you're depressed, changing your language won't make a difference. However, I think language can serve, it's more like a speedometer. So it's reflecting, and it can serve as a cue about how you're doing. So for example, I've always thought of this kind of experiment. I've never done it, but I know if I sent you into a room with a small group and I say, okay, when you're in there, don't use the word I, use words like we and so forth. And I don't think you'd be more or less likely to become a leader. However, if I said beforehand, okay, when you go in there, I want you to try to become the leader. Really work at trying to do this. If I told you to do that, you would do much better than chance at becoming the leader, and your language would change in line with what a leader's is. So it's really it's the psychological state is driving the language, I think.
I'm curious how you got people to share secrets. And have them, like, did you promise they wouldn't be, share a secret that would then be analyzed?
So
Curious about that.
So here's the way these studies work. You know, there's not many times in our lives where you're given the opportunity to really let go and explore your deepest emotions and thoughts. So they come into the lab and they talk to me or maybe a graduate student. And I say, okay, in this study, we're asking people to write about their deepest thoughts and feelings about the most upsetting experiences in their lives. And what I'd like to have you do is write about this and really let go and explore your deepest thoughts and feelings. Your name will never be linked with what you're writing. We won't share your writing with others except researchers. It will be analyzed along with your questionnaires. But we really are interested in what makes you tick. And I would say over the last, I actually haven't done an expressive writing study in a few years, but I'm sure I ran several thousand people back from the beginning, and I can think of one person who did not participate. Virtually everybody participates. And it's kind of like being on an airplane, where all of a sudden you get in this weird, you're sitting next to somebody and you're both talking about secrets.
Any questions? Yeah.
Also sort of on the veins of like, obviously this is incredibly intellectually interesting. And how do we think about bringing it to our own lives? Like, my roommate is dating this girl, and for 4 years, do I tell him to go like look up their emails and like do something else? What do you think that, how can we use this in our lives in interesting ways that actually impact?
I think the place to start using it in interesting ways is to try it yourself. And I do not think writing every day for the rest of your life is healthy. In fact, I think it's unhealthy. I view writing as kind of a life course correction, that every now and then, and I do this myself every few months, every year or so, sometimes I'll just sit down and write for, a day or two, 3 days, for 15 minutes a day or 20, whatever, exploring my deepest thoughts and feelings in terms of what's going on in my life right now. And I think it's a really powerful way to put things in order, because we don't usually do that. Often we might have someone that we're close to and we can talk to them about some topics, but there's some topics you can't talk about. Mm-hmm.
So you have talked about parts of language which generally is quite stable, but language in general sort of evolves over time. And there are certain elements of language which evolve sort of slowly and some more rapidly. And then there are big sort of disruptive elements like the internet, right? Two people sort of behave differently, and the way they express things differently. So some of the things that we explored in one of the projects that I was involved in earlier is that when you think about proper nouns and certain sort of attributes, for example, people who like, The Daily Show or Friends, right? In the early 2000s were people who had a particular personality. But now people with the same personality would like some other things. They would not like Daily Show, right? Because it's moved on. They have moved on in some sense.
So what you're describing is the distinction between content and style, content and function words. I don't care what you like, your function words are going to be pretty similar. And if you look at the evolution of language, function words are really similar to Shakespeare's time. But if you look at his content words, geez, and that's why it's so hard to read him. But the reality is, and this is true over the lifetime, and this gets into some of the issues that I've been doing here at MSR, which is, can you identify personality through things like Twitter, or I'm particularly interested in search terms. Now, what you're suggesting is search terms are going to change over the course of, you would think, even 2 years. The data I've been analyzing, man, that's not true at all. There's some features that do change, but others are really remarkably similar. And if we looked at them over 10 years or 20 years, yeah, there's going to be some changes, but I would bet that the people who are interested in celebrities today are going to be interested in celebrities 20 years from now.
There is a related question, right? So when we try to look at how people sort of look at things and sort of the words they use on Facebook or Twitter versus what the words they used for search, they are very different things, because when it comes to Twitter and Facebook, there is also an element of portraying a particular persona, right? You don't use the word that you will sort of use while you're searching, and you can sort of see that there are certain types of topics which never get sort of...
Exactly, but their function words are going to correlate at least 0.3 with each other. So their personality is still the same, whether they're doing one or the other.
It's an extension of the evolution question. I think Twitter has a lot of misspellings, a lot of errors that actually kind of stick and become the way people talk. And I'm wondering, how messy is the input data usually, and can you learn anything from that messiness?
This is a statistical question. if you're looking at 1 million people, who cares? We can handle error. Error in terms of finding truth is a function of sample size or number of data points. And as we get, if you're looking at a particular person or a small group of people, then these are things that it starts to make a difference. But once we move to scale, that's not something that I personally lose any sleep about. Because I've analyzed data that was really dirty and really clean, and the same data set to see would my conclusions be substantively different, and I've never found that to be the case.
So you talked a bit about the role of writing, but when people do this expressive writing, is it important that it be shared, that they think it's going to be shared? No. And are verbal confessions like what you do with a psychologist, in treatment and therapy, is that sort of the same role, or is writing distinctly different than the therapist role?
I think they're very similar. The difference is when you're sharing with somebody else, there is a high threat there. So even talking to a therapist, there are some things that a lot of people won't talk about. It's too threatening. If you can completely trust this person you're talking to, whether it's a close friend or a therapist or whatever, then it probably can be as good as writing, as long as that person is supportive of you, is accepting of you. But that's the beauty of writing. Writing is the audience is you. And when we do our research, we make it clear that they'll never get feedback. They'll never be linked with what they're writing. We've done studies. We had people write on a magic pad, those things you have as a kid, that you write on it and you lift it up and it disappears. And we get the same effects writing on a magic pad as on paper that you turn in. So I think the real active ingredient here is translating the experience into language.
What about politicians? You said you did some analysis of them, but a lot of them have speechwriters. So does personality still come across, or is it the speechwriter's personality coming in?
It's a little bit of both. That's why I prefer press conferences that are not scripted, or at least not as scripted. And it's also interesting. Most good speechwriters try to mimic the personality of the person. I've got one very quick story. John Kerry ran for president against Bush in 2004. If you remember him, he was a stick. He was formal, and he just couldn't connect with people. And I read in the New York Times that his handlers were aware of this, and so what they were encouraging him to do was to use more we words in his speech. And I read that and I thought, oh, Jesus, this guy is toast. Now, it's interesting because use of we among a politician is a marker of being emotionally distant. And so here his people are telling him, okay, now let's try to be really distant. And he could do it. But what was also interesting is language really maps a person. He was rigid and kind of controlled, and his language was the same. It's kind of part of the package deal. And what we find is, in terms of nonverbals and verbals, they tend to go together. And had he spoken using I words in that same way, would it have made a difference? Beats me.
So a quick question, Jamie, maybe we can end on this because not a lot of hands going up anymore. This is an extension of our dinner conversation, and it gets at the why. And maybe you can, I know this is speculation, because you have a really nice finding that writing about trauma and so on is cathartic and useful for things, including health streams down in the future. Mm-hmm. Why? What's your set of best guesses as to speculate why, and how might we further study that to come to the answers?
Okay, so this is one of the big problems in science is that we've all been trained to think that there is a single answer that's best, a particular theory that's better than others. Writing is interesting because it is a cascade of phenomena that drive it. And this has been one thing that, because there have been enough studies now, we know some of the reasons it occurs. First of all, you've had an upsetting experience, a traumatic experience. Think about what's happening. You obsess about it. You think about it. You're walking down the street. You're thinking about it. You're talking to a friend, and you're sometimes thinking about it then as well. You don't have working memory. You don't have free memory to devote to the conversation. You don't have free memory to devote to reading and studying the way you usually do. And by the way, people who've had a traumatic experience have more problems in their relationships. They do more poorly in school. They have more difficulty sleeping, and on and on and on. We know that after writing, people have greater working memory. So there have been now several studies showing greater working memory immediately afterwards. We also know after writing, they sleep better. Sleep is one of the most powerful markers of health, and it's also linked to immune function. And there have been now a number of studies showing that writing is associated with enhanced immune function. And given our MD in the room, immune function is a dirty concept because the immune system is so complex. But the point is that sleep is good for you. We also know sleep disruptions associated with depression. So here we now know greater working memory. People sleep better. The other issue is that we also know that writing about something helps to organize the experience, putting it into words. Think about what happens when you have a traumatic experience and you're not able to talk to somebody about it, or you can't write about it. What happens is you're walking down the street and you're thinking, oh, I should have done this. And then you start thinking about this feature of it. And then you go a little bit further, and then you think, oh, God, I felt so guilty about this. And then you start, but you don't put it all together. And what writing does is it forces putting things together in a coherent, meaningful way. One other issue is just merely writing about it helps to acknowledge that it occurs. The number of people who have a traumatic experience, and what they do is they work to not think about it, to pretend it didn't happen, and just labeling it makes a difference. There's been some nice work on using fMRI data at UCLA showing just the mere labeling of an experience is associated with a change. And then all of this, what's so interesting about this is it's also associated with social changes. So for example, we've done a couple of studies where we give people beepers, or not beepers, it's a device that I developed with one of my graduate students called the EAR, the electronically activated recorder. It used to be an actual tape recorder, and then it became a digital recorder, and now it's just a cell phone. It comes on for 30 seconds, goes off for 12 minutes, and we ask people to wear it for several days. And in our writing studies, we would have them wear this for 2 days before they were assigned a condition, and then again a month after the writing. And what we found was that people who were in the experimental condition, who wrote about trauma, spent more time talking to others afterwards, laughing more, they were more socially engaged. And here was the cool part from my perspective. We gave them 1 million questionnaires, and we asked them, tell me about your life, how much are you talking with others, and so forth. We get no differences in questionnaires. People don't see that their lives have changed because self-reports are self-theories. People are working on what they think their life is. And it's not, and we are now seeing objectively that there are these changes. So this is why there's not a single answer, because writing is bringing about all of these changes that are really, each one on its own is often hard to measure, hard to conceptualize, hard for even the person themselves to see. But I think that's the complex answer.
Okay, with that, we'll have time to Jamie right after. So thanks very much for your time.
Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.